Okay, good afternoon, almost evening. My name is Hamed Khosravi. Together with Platon Isaias, we will be moderating today's talk. We are very pleased to have Sausan and Hani with us as a series of programs in conjunction with the exhibition that we are running next door about war in Raqqa and destruction in Syria. So this is the second talk in the 4 talks that we're going to have. 2 more is on the list. Today's discussion would be, in particular, investigation on Syria's destruction and reconstruction strategies, which will be explained by a joint presentation by Sausan and Hani. And then probably we can open up the session to Q&A and more engagement from the public. Just to give you a heads up about our guests and to introduce them, I think it's good to know that both of them are graduates from UCL, Urban Planning and Development and Building and both, Urban Planning and Development with distinction. They have a joint initiative called SAKAN, which is dealing with the housing as, let's say, an entry point of active participation in the reconstruction of Syria. This is something that we will discuss more during the Q&A. The agency of housing, some sort of space that we can probably participation with the locals can be helpful in order to bypass some sort of state-oriented, state-dominated area of post-conflict urbanization. I'm very curious to know more about your strategies and your ideas about that. Sausan Abu Zainuddin, she's an architect, Syrian architect and urban development practitioner. She co-founded also Riba, which is a studio established in 2013 in Syria that addresses the conflict-related urban challenges through our alternative localized practices. Also, as I mentioned, you have this collaboration with this research, which hopefully will be online, if I'm not wrong, as some sort of pedagogic tool that, in a way, educates the people and reaches to a wider public for self-made housing, perhaps, and localized strategies for habitation in Syria. Something that you will learn more today. Hani also is co-founder of Plus Studios, an architectural design and visualization service firm that has been working on a range of projects, including urban regeneration, housing, and public service projects. He also co-founded Cube Team Architects, a local firm in Damascus, based in Damascus, that won national awards for urban development and infrastructure project proposal with Damascus Municipality and Governance. Again, just to more clarify where this presentation lies within the wide range of activities that our 2 guests are currently involved with, is, as far as I understood it, is somewhere is an in-progress project that is in a way aided with the French organization, or not?
It's, we speak about the curriculum.
Oh, the curriculum, yes.
It's a
EU-funded project based in France. Yes. That will be online, will be an online tool for communication and also education. And then probably we extend the discussion towards the activities and the practices of SAKAN in order to implement ideas within that platform later. With that, I invite Hani and Sausan to take on stage, please. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone, and thanks for the introduction. We both are Syrian architects who studied architecture in Syria, and then we did our postgraduate studies here in the UK, and we've been jointly researching on the reconstruction, the destruction and the reconstruction of Syria. And as Hamed mentioned, we're developing a curriculum that's the online training tool on the urbanization of Syria and reconstruction in the conflict context. It is going to be online, but unfortunately in the first stages only for Syrian students who don't have access to universities. Perhaps on later stages it will be open to the public. And our presentation today is our notes from the collective work that we do through developing the curriculum, but through working also on the housing project, our joint initiative in Syria, and other research that we do with different organizations. Well, Syria is no longer the hot topic in the news. Most people think that the war is over in there, with the government recapturing most of the areas that were previously lost to the rebels. And with the reconstruction starting in there, not just through the coping mechanisms that people are developing on the ground, rehabilitating their houses, finding shelter here and there, but also with large-scale reconstruction projects led by the Syrian government with the participation of UN agencies and international organizations, even if not under the term reconstruction. As we all know, the international community, the EU and the US, are holding Reconstruction Fund as a leverage in Syria. Still, organizations are participating through rehabilitation projects or by playing the name here and there. So to speak of recovery today in Syria is to speak about these reconstruction processes that are taking place and that are supposedly to pursue a peaceful future in Syria. So recovery somehow implies future, but future is rooted in the past, and we cannot speak about a peaceful future if we do not speak about the past's violence and trauma and injustices and grievances. That's why today we're gonna start by exploring the context in which this war took place, the urban context in which this war was initiated, was escalated, and was enacted through the Syrian cities. We will be talking about how the urban sphere, the urban arrangements were manipulated in the Syrian context as a tool in this war to pursue certain interests, political or economic interests, mostly to homogenize the country from a political and an economic perspective. So that's why, so that when we talk about recovery, a future that celebrates diversity and that's an inclusive environment that celebrates diversity and differences, we can talk about reconstruction then.
So yeah, exactly. When we speak about the future, we all want to see Syria, which is inclusive, which is a place for every sect of the community, every segment of the community. We want inclusive Syria, but unfortunately, this is how it's turning today. I mean, this is a quote from Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. He said in 2017, after a major operation to capture or recapture land from the opposition, he said, "We lost the best of our people and our infrastructure, but we want a healthier and more homogeneous community." Homogeneity means something, if we look at it from a positive perspective, something good. We all want to have a homogeneous community, but unfortunately, from the eyes of our president, or at least from the eyes of the action that of the Syrian government, what we saw is that they aim for a society, a homogenized society, but is homogenized from the sense that is include only one political sect. It's a society where the loyalists to the government are empowered, where the economical cronies of the regimes are empowered as well, where the opposition, especially those people who support the opposition, the local base, the local support of the opposition are uprooted from their places, displaced, or even genocide. I mean, we're going to be speaking today about the term herbicide, and I mean, to some extent, many of the scholars said what Syria witnessed is an herbicide. Herbicide, for those who are not familiar with the term, is derived from the word genocide. Genocide is the deliberate killing, the deliberate destruction of a specific segment of the community. Herbicide describes the act of violence against the urban environment to deliberately eradicate, as we said, diversity, eradicate a specific group of the society. Herbicide has been defined as the violent attempt to impose certain urban arrangement. Those urban arrangements aim for enforcing homogeneity. So homogeneity is not always positive, if we see it from this perspective. The term has been first used, for those who are not familiar with it, in the 60s in the USA. This is following a mass displacement of people due to massive infrastructure project. But then the term was used after that in the 80s, for example, in Lebanon, in Bosnia, later on in the 90s, and it's still being used today in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and always referring to the violence against the urban environment for the aim of eradicating a specific group from the society.
So how this term herbicide was employed in the different geographies and contexts, we can say that it's usually manifested in three different trajectories. First is the systematic destruction of the built environment, and second is denying cities to particular groups, because herbicide is aimed at homogenizing the urban sphere. So when we deny cities to particular group, denying them access to services, infrastructure, in the aim of vacuuming these cities from their residents, and this is an act of genocide. And then thirdly, in the discriminatory frameworks of Reconstruction, or we can say in Reconstruction and its destructive interpretation. Now, the term has been extensively used recently in the Syrian context. Scholars have been writing about this, and conferences are being held to discuss it. Today, we will be laying several examples to see how the trajectories of herbicide are manifested in the Syrian context. We do acknowledge that herbicide manipulating the urban sphere has been a strategy that is employed by different parties in the Syrian context. But today we will be specifically looking at how the government specifically manipulated the urban sphere, because we believe that this was not just for military purposes. So different parties in the Syrian conflict, in the Syrian context, they used the urban arrangements in a way or another to win a certain battle or for military purposes. But in the case in which the Syrian government employed urban arrangements, we believe that this was part of a systematic strategy to pursue political and economic context, a strategy that employed destruction in the name of reconstruction. So we will be laying several examples to speak about how the urban arrangements are weaponized and militarized in the Syrian context. Another reason is actually that Syria, the urban sphere in Syria is militarized way before 2011, way before the revolution started, the revolution that was later on turned into a war. It was militarized as means to ensure citizens' obedience and citizens' discipline in the military state that Syria used to be.
So speaking about the three different manifestations of herbicide, the question is now, have we witnessed those manifestations actually in Syria to say that Syria witnessed herbicide? And as Sausan said, we're going to speak about a few different examples. This is the map of Aleppo. Aleppo is the second largest city in Syria. It had over 2 million, maybe 2.5 million in population. What we see here, the colored map, the green is referring to the areas that was controlled by the opposition in 2015, and the red is the areas that was controlled by the government army. In 2015, this city undergone a massive battle. It was named the mother of the battles because it was very extensive and it was of highly importance for all warring party. one of the weapons that was highly used in this battle was the barrel bombs. For those who doesn't know what barrel bomb is a cylinder. It's just actually a metal cylinder filled with explosive and with metal fragments, just thrown from a helicopter down to residential area, and it's from its name, it's not precise weapon and it's prohibited to be used in highly dense areas. Unfortunately, this weapon has been used, and this was the result. All the dots, the yellow and red dots, are indicating a destroyed building, either partly destroyed or fully destroyed. If we just try to compare between the map, we can easily see that all the green areas were the areas that was targeted. As I said, is using, in many cases, using this weapon. In 2016, the Syrian Network for Human Rights documented that only in that year, 12,858 barrel bombs were dropped over different cities in Syria. Amnesty International reported in Aleppo, after a study of 8 attacks, that 8 attacks by barrel bombs ended up killing 188 civilians and 1 rebel fighter. So, I mean, looking at those numbers and looking at the pattern of the destruction, looking at the intensity of destruction, looking at the sort of weapon which was used, we can easily say that the destruction in Aleppo wasn't just a collateral damage, it wasn't just a result of the fighting in the city, but was actually an instrument which was utilized in the war for specific political reasons. And this is just a photo of the Aleppo after being destructed in 2015.
So not only an instrument for political oppression or for political homogenization, but also scholars argue that it's also for economic purposes. So this is a map of Homs, another city, one of the largest cities in Syria, and a city that was identified the capital of the revolution in the early days of the revolution. So this map shows the city center in yellow and red, and then towards the west is where the original residents of the city lived and expanded, and then in the east, the orange parts are where the newcomers, the internal economic migrants who came to the city for economic reasons, have settled in informal settlements. Now this is the pattern of destruction in Homs. We can clearly see that it draws a line going from the north into the city center and back to the south, and it precisely walks into Sunni neighborhoods and the neighborhoods of the city center. Now it's complicated to go into whether this was aimed at sectarian homogenization, because I think it's the argument of the hen and the egg in the Syrian context, where they revolted because they were Sunni, or they were targeted because they were Sunni, or they were targeted because they revolted. Most of the majority is Sunni, most of the neighborhoods that revolted were Sunni. But at least what we can claim here is that it passed by the neighborhoods of the city center, which have been identified previously in 2007 as part of an old master plan for the city Homs, a master plan that in 2007 mobilized political unrest because people suspected that the redevelopment deals that were held under this plan were deliberately confiscating their lands and properties with unfair or no compensation at all, and then awarding them to the private sector to be developed into neoliberal projects. So back in 2000, starting from 2007, people have demonstrated against the plan. And this sign, they're saying, don't mix our land with our blood, referring to the fact that the conflict that might come out of this plan. Due to the political unrest, the government put the plans on hold. But then after 2011, the patterns of destruction that specifically targeted these neighborhoods are seen as part of a strategy to bring the old Homs dream to life again.
Yet another example. I mean, people might say, well, Aleppo example, for example, or Homs were kind of cities where like a major battle has happened. But then how about other places? This case is very important. This report is by the Human Rights Watch and was reported in 2013. And it documented in two main cities, in Damascus in the bottom of the picture, and Hama in the top of the picture. Those neighborhoods marked in red were all deliberately and unlawfully demolished. Demolished not necessarily because there was a conflict in those cities. They were demolished actually by bulldozers and by explosives, not by rockets and by the fighting. And all those neighborhoods were opposition, let's say, okay, I mean, communities that supported the opposition lived in those areas, and this is why they were targeted. People in those areas. I mean, we're speaking about massive places. We're not speaking about few buildings. I mean, as you can see, it's an area of equal to 200 football field. It's very big, and it was all bulldozed to the ground. People had no time, no warning, so they were not allowed to go and collect their stuff. In some of the cases, they were allowed just to get their stuff and leave their houses, but there were no kind of proper notice, and people were not offered any compensation. So just demolition for the sake of demolition, for the sake of punishing the community that lived in there. So this is another example that showed us that destruction can be explained in other explanation than it's just a collateral damage or it's a result of the fighting.
The government justified these demolitions as urban renewal projects, and that's how it came on the public media. But then officials also were recorded in interviews saying, we finally drove opposition fighters out of their homes. But Human Rights Watch concluded in their reports that these were unlawful demolitions because the areas were not used for military purposes by the opposition. They were not stores for weapons. They were not places where there was operational planning or anything. So they were concluded to be unlawful.
The authority would say that those are illegal settlements. Yet maybe they're partly illegal. Some of the people built on their lands illegally, but they still own the land. So it doesn't make sense. And then we're in the middle of the war. This is in 2013. The war was in its peak. It doesn't make any sense that you spend time on now doing kind of regeneration project. It's maybe if you have some money, if you have some time, you spend it on the people who are being displaced and they need housing. It's not the time for demolishing more houses. I mean, we already have a lot being destructed all the time. So, yeah.
So another way through which herbicide is manifested in Syria is what we call the denial of the cities, denying cities to the residents. And that was done by simply making life unbearable in those areas who identify as opposition strongholds or who have significant economic strategic interest for the government. So how cities were denied to their residents is through different tactics. First and foremost is the deliberate siege that was enforced on so many localities in Syria. This is Homs, but it was also applied on Eastern Ghouta. We've seen that in the media a lot last year and also in many other localities in Syria. That meant blocking movement of people, completely blocking movements of people and of supplies. Medical supplies and food were completely blocked. Another tactic is to destroy infrastructure in those localities and to cut power. So even in places where the infrastructure was still operational, power was cut for years. Destroying vital civilian facilities, hospitals, schools, bakeries, you name it, mosques, churches, local markets, civil defense centers. All of these were documented by international or local human rights groups. Massacres of the bread was a term that became common in Syria and is seen as a strategy to target lines of people waiting for hours to get their bread under siege. So it's for hospitals and schools.
This tactic was used not only, I mean, I think the last photo was from Aleppo, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not quite sure. But this technique wasn't only used in Aleppo or in the suburb of Damascus. It was used all over the country. After exhausting the areas, after exhausting the cities, denying them from water, electricity, medical care, all of those services, people will be put to choose between two different options: either to evacuate, and those are the buses. Every Syrian would know what green bus is. Green bus is a term that is, actually they are green buses, but when you tell Syrian green bus, they will understand that you mean the buses that used to evacuate people or to forcibly evict people from their cities to other cities. Usually it's to Idlib or the northern part of Syria. So people will have either to accept being displaced and to leave their cities, or to agree on what we call local reconciliation agreements. And if you agree to stay in the town and reconcile with the government, then you'll risk yourself being detained or being recruited by the army to go and fight on the government side. People will be kind of putting themselves in risk. So people had to choose between those two options. And in many cases, people prefer just to leave their cities. So another way of vacuuming actually the city from their original people. Some people would say, well, this is a temporary. It's much needed to do such actions in the war. People need to leave the city because it's in a war, then they come back. But what we're feeling today, that some of the reports are coming and saying that, well, some of the neighborhoods, after people leave them, the neighborhood will be destroyed. And this is from a report, I think it's from Human Rights Watch. This is a neighborhood of Kabul. A satellite image is a neighborhood near the Damascus, or in Damascus, near the center. It's an opposition area, and recently all the opposition, the families evacuated from it under the deal. After evacuation, after it's an empty city, this would happen. They just demolished the whole city. So blocking people from returning to their houses. So when people come and say, well, it's just a temporary, now we're saying, well, look what's happening. If this kind of carry on to happen, then no one will be able to return. If we forget about all other aspects that block people from returning from a security perspective, but now they don't have their actual house to return to.
The houses that were still standing when people left them, so they were not destructed. They were still able to be used. Families were still able to use the houses when they left them, but then they were bulldozed. Well, the government did not use urban planning as an excuse this time. They said they were they were
remnant of explosions.
They were destroying the tunnels that the rebels built in these areas, so they did not at least use urban planning as an excuse.
I'm not a military expert, but I cannot see how like a destruction of a tunnel will end up.
Well, yeah.
It's just like
this is very
totally raised to the ground.
by.
It's a zero building in the map. It's just not excusable.
This is very close to the city center, and then people in the government-held Damascus were seeing the explosions and the smoke and the sounds and everything, and they were like, what's going on? This is a vacuumed area. So the excuse was, we're still destroying rebels' tunnels.
What's important to tell that this was one of the last major stronghold of the opposition in Damascus. So it had a kind of an aspect of a revenge that, okay, this is what we're going to do. You left, now this is what happened to your house.
So back to vacuuming cities from their residents, another technique that was used is tampering with housing, land, and property rights through different techniques. So the actual targeting of registries and facilities and infrastructure of properties. This is the registry of Homs, which was seen to be deliberately burnt on purpose because it was in a neighborhood that remained more or less very safe, and this building was the only one that was targeted in that neighborhood, the only one. Other techniques include the falsification of transactions, fraud, but also using the documents of housing, land, and property rights as means of surveillance when they ask for them to give access to people. So in general, using housing, land, and property rights tempering with these as means to facilitate taking over the properties of certain groups in Syria, well, mostly identified as Sunni, who are opponents to the government, and be awarded to other groups, mostly identified as fighters or loyalists who come from a Shia or Alawite background. That's at least as documented in the falsified transaction that were recorded, where people would just wake up to find that their houses were sold.
So now, I mean, we spoke a lot about destruction, and we saw how it is. It's been manipulated up until today. Actually, it's been manipulated by the government to achieve certain interests and certain political goal. But now, how about reconstruction? Some people would say, well, this is the past. We're almost. I mean, the war is almost over. The government is in control of the majority of the country, or what we call the useful Syria, and now is the time for reconstruction. Why to speak about destruction? Well, we speak about destruction first to learn from it, and second, because reconstruction is not in a better shape today. Reconstruction seems or turned to be just another phase of manipulating the urban sphere. I mean, reconstruction is being used and utilized exactly like destruction was used, not in better at all. I mean, we can see this from the legislative framework. In 2012, I mean, many laws were announced in the last few years. Those laws were always kind of laying the ground for practices that are indiscriminatory. We're not going to speak about them in detail, but we're going to shed light on two of those laws. Law number 66 of 2012, this laid the legal and financial ground for working in the informal areas, in the informal settlements areas, actually to reconstruct them by the private sector. The private sector is highly dominated by the regime financial cronies. So again, just giving them more power in a way to serve the regime on interest. The law number 10 of 2008, I believe, law number 10? 2018, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
2018. This is another law which was released to empower the local administrative unit to create redevelopment zone within their areas to be designated for reconstruction project or for redevelopment project. This law entailed really extensive requirement for the local residents, for the people who live in those areas that will become designated for reconstruction project. They entailed extensive requirement for them to prove their ownership of their house and for lands. And in the case of the failure to show their proof, I think every government will have the paper themselves, but then they ask people to come and bring those documents. But if you fail to bring your document, then your house, your land, the ownership of it will revert to the local administration council. So another way of appropriating land in the preparation for a reconstruction project.
Now, the extensive procedural requirements for these laws are problematic for a wider sect of the Syrian population, simply because because people don't have safe access to the government's institutions and registries. We're talking here about refugees who can't follow up with those complicated procedures. We're talking about refugees, internally displaced people, people who live in non-government held areas. We're talking about detainees and their families, disappeared people and their families, let alone killed people and their families, and all who identify as opponents who have any sort of link with opposition activities. All of those do not have safe access to the government institutes to claim their right to just begin in the process of reconstruction. We're speaking here about mostly half of the Syrian population.
And reconstruction is not theory or a long-term goal anymore. Reconstruction has already started. The Syrian government embarked their own project, and this is just a photo from one of the informal settlements in Damascus. near rich neighborhood, near, I mean, it's very strategic location in Damascus, and it's surrounded by many embassies. The campus of the Damascus University is just behind the Iranian embassy. It happened to be behind the Iranian embassy for some reason. And they started their first project from here, a project which they named Maruta City. And Maruta City is looked at as the blueprint or the pilot project for reconstruction that is being successful at the moment and is going to be replicated in other places. What's really important to say here that informal, I mean, sometimes people will say, well, this is informal settlement, okay, it's to reconstruct it. First, it hasn't, I mean, it's not demolished. It's not demolished. It wasn't demolished because of the war. So save the energy and do something else. Second, informality in Syria has a different meaning. It's not like informality in the UK. Informality can be someone who owned the land, but they violated the planning regulation and they build a house. It's an agricultural land and should not be building a house and you build your house. People in poverty, they need to find a solution. Or it could be you have the permission to build your house, but you just build an extra house. Many people in Syria, I mean, maybe 50% of the presidential area in Damascus is informal settlements. So, I mean, for someone who knows the city, would say this doesn't make any sense. But again, this was an important location for political, for economical reason, and this is why it started with they started with this area.
So the implementation of this project, which is called Maruta City, Maruta is a Syriac name that means sovereignty, and it was chosen carefully by the government in this location that used to be called something else. The implementation has already started. Properties of the people, these properties were evaluated based on their current conditions. They evaluated the properties, the houses, the cement structures, not the lands. And this is how, in this way, they did not account for the value of the potential development that's going to be. So people's property were evaluated based on this condition, and then they were compensated with shares in the redevelopment zone that's yet to come. But the new projects are way too expensive so that the compensation can actually give people access to these luxurious high-end apartments that are being built. This meant that people, the original residents who owned the land in there, were faced with very limited options. Either to buy new shares so that they can have access to these, or to form companies where they can develop the land themselves, or at least to sell the shares they were compensated with in public auctions. Through this strategy, the government expelled a majority of the original residents of this particular place with no compensation or unfair compensation, or in many cases no compensation at all for tenants, for example, or people who didn't have the rights to the land or the document they owned. And at the same time, they facilitated the access of the private sector investors who have access to the developments now at the expense of the rights of its original people.
So, yeah, we're speaking today about post-conflict reconstruction. We're speaking about recovery. I mean, when we say post-conflict reconstruction, and after seeing what we saw today, can we still say that we are post-conflict? I mean, are we really post-conflict? Has the conflict really ended, or the conflict is yet to come? This is the question. I mean, when we speak about recovery, we need to speak about all the grievances of people. We need to speak about healing those grievances. And the practices that we saw today produces just more of those grievances, just a layer on top of the layer, another layer of the conflict on top of the old layers of the conflict. We have now political conflict. We have now class conflict. I mean, we see those poor people leaving their houses and new rich people coming in, then we're just creating another kind of class-based conflict. When we saw the case of Homs, another sectarian-based conflict. Maybe people from one sect will say why we've been expelled and the other sect has not been expelled. So a layer on top of the layer, just accumulating conflict. this will never lead to recovery. When we speak about post-conflict reconstruction and we speak about herbicide, there's no way to see in the horizon any peaceful future unless we find a way to undo this herbicide which is happening today. At least if we don't want to undo it, if we cannot undo it, at least to stop it, to say, well, this is enough, this cannot go in this way. This is if we don't speak about all the past grievances that was actually the reasons behind the conflict in the first place. If we want to speak about right-based framework for reconstruction, this will never happen unless we really understand destruction and reconstruction in their political and within their conflict context. We need to understand what is the result of deconstruction or destruction behind the damage of the building. And we need to understand what is the result of reconstruction behind just the new building arising from the ground.
So, how to move forward? Any entry points into that very complex situation? Well, at least this is the map of Syria today. So it's true that the government, represented in the red color, the pink color, is recapturing most of the land that was previously lost to the rebels. But there are still, and this is the area, the red area is where the discriminatory and the legislative framework and the reconstruction framework that was put by the government is enforced. It's not yet enforced outside these territories. But we still have the yellow parts, we still have the green parts, and we've seen in the exhibition earlier today in Raqqa the destruction, the vast destruction in there. These are areas where the government authorities, the government's legislative frameworks are not yet enforced. So they're a place where we can look into how a just and inclusive and a right-based approach to reconstruction may unfold in Syria. And the green areas, Idlib, that's now, that's currently, as we speak, is under a military offense by the government to capture the land. Idlib, that little green spot on the left, is the area where all the forced eviction campaigns from other areas that were captured by the government. So people evicted from there were relocated to that green spot in the top. So it had all of those who identify as opposition from all around Syria. There's a huge displacement and housing crisis in there. The number of displaced people, the situation of the camps, it's a huge crisis that is left to, like the response to this was left to the humanitarian sphere to respond in the form of camps, inadequate shelter, or that was left for the commercial response. It's a construction hub. The areas is a construction hub where small and mid-scale private developers are just building houses in a very inflated market, a market that is equal. So the rental market in 2016, I think, was similar to that of Istanbul in that area, in the peripheries of Aleppo. So it's a very highly inflated market, but there's demand, a very high demand, and there's people who could afford to pay this, mostly those who work for the international NGOs. But then you have all the locals, the displaced, who still live in camps and who work in the local market and who do not have access to this, and they were just left for nothing, inadequate shelters. So this is an entry point that we can think of housing. How can we take housing out of its commercial interpretation and deal with it as a right for people to have access to adequate housing. At the same time, use it as a catalyst for the local economic recovery and to catalyze local markets in there. How we can come up with a hybrid models of housing that can give access to people who need it, but at the same time it does not contribute to the inflated market. So these are questions for us to take and to think of how we can set the ground for a more inclusive approach and rights-based approach for reconstruction.
But if we zoom out a little bit and we think of kind of the entirety of Syria, and we kind of think of even the kind of government-controlled areas, and we see how the international community here in Europe and other places is really dealing with the Syrian case, we really see a dark image, unfortunately. What's happening today, that the EU made it very clear, and USA as well, that they will never contribute to the reconstruction efforts in Syria unless there's really kind of a true political process in place, which might make sense for a while. But then when we think of what we spoke about today, and when we think of destruction and reconstruction not as neutral process, when we think of reconstruction as a process that can hurt people, actually, that can kind of enforce the displacement of those people, then we say, well, time not on the side, or waiting is not in the interest of the local people. The more we wait, the more those practices will be enforced. The more we wait, the more people will be displaced. The more we wait, the more the government cronies will be empowered. The more we wait, the more the loyalists will be empowered. So waiting is not the solution. For now, Europe and in Europe, UK, the USA are all just standing and waiting and observing, and waiting until the moment when the time for reconstruction starts. But as we say, reconstruction has already started, at least from one perspective. Today, the negotiation is about who to pay. Is it the Gulf? Is it Saudi Arabia or Qatar or the Gulf? Is it Europe? Who's going to pay for the reconstruction? Again, the question is not who's going to pay. The question is not how much money is going to be paid. The question is what sort of reconstruction we really want. What sort of practices we really would want to put in place. It's not just throwing money into the country. It's not going to work. Are we going to support the project that we just show, kind of with the big high rises expelling people from their places? So again, time is not on, waiting is not in the interest of the people. It's not about the money. It's about the type of reconstruction and withdrawal from the whole process, saying, well, we're not going to contribute to this reconstruction because it's not good. We're going to wait until the conflict is end. First, it's not realistic because the conflict is not going to end, as we saw. It's just getting bigger and bigger. Second, because withdrawing from the whole process and sitting in the observer seat will never make any change. You cannot just sit and wait for those practices to be further enforced. I think we'll end up with this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello? Thank you for this incredibly interesting presentation. I think we have a lot of time for questions. Maybe starting this, part of your intervention, I should probably ask one question just to start with, which is, we take it from where you actually left it, and I would just, I'm very much interested in the, let's say, the technology and the materiality of this reconstruction process, right? Materials themselves are part of the conflict. So reconstruction is not just the layouts, but it's an entire technology of control of who has access to what, who controls the quantities of what, and so on and so forth. We know, for example, from other places that, concrete, bricks, plaster, they have their own role within these processes. So I'm wondering if you have something to add, because I guess your points about property and how property rights are mobilized for displacement were fantastically interesting. I'm wondering if there is some sort of research about how material realities on the ground during the destruction, but also for the reconstruction process, have been somehow evolving in the Syrian war.
So, Can you hear me this way? So, I mean, material is like building. It's physical, but it has different aspects to it. So where you're bringing the material do make a difference. For example, if you're importing the material from a government, supportive government, it's different from importing it from Turkey opposition supporting government. So this one aspect of it, where to bring it from in what way, in what axis you bring it is another story as well. If you're bringing it through the Turkish border, for example, then you're bringing it from a border which is not under the control of the government, which means in a way, for the government, it's breaking the sovereignty of the government because you're bringing some things illegally into the country. So it has this political aspect. But I think, I mean, if we have something to share is how we use materials in our own project. We always think that materials, despite whether they are concrete or brick or whatever they are, as long as they are locally produced, then they will be part of revising or kind of empowering the local market, the local economy. So in our project, in our attempts, we try always to rely as much as possible on locally produced materials, just to say that we're supporting, or just to make sure that we're supporting the local economy. So this is only one aspect. Add something?
I think the politics of the materials used in the reconstruction can be seen with the latest international trade fair that was held in Damascus, and under which the government actually said that this is marking the beginning of the reconstruction process. During that fair, the government actually signed contracts with different countries, including China, India, Japan, and others who were kind of passive in the Syrian conflict, but now they are in a way or another contributing to the layers of conflict that are being consolidated by the reconstruction project. So there is politics to the materials, to the investments in there. I think the international political allies for the Syrian government throughout their war on people, they were paid by investments in the country. So the phosphates that were the contracts of controlling the whatever the mine, whatever there is of investment opportunities in Syria, electricity, phosphate, oil. This is how the military allies were paid, actually. So that's to say.
Questions? Yes.
Hi, just starting where you left off your initial talk. Okay, the government is now rebuilding. How do you stop them? I totally understand why you would want a proper regeneration plan, but how do you stop them doing what they're doing now?
We can't say that we can stop them, but we can show better examples maybe in areas outside of the regime control. We can always play the money card. I mean, the Syria doesn't have enough money to build many projects. They're doing this. It's a prototype. It's an area with a big size, but it's not the entire of the city, so they can't carry on unless they have further money. The money is with the Arab Gulf, it's with the international community, with Europe, with USA. It's everywhere, but not in Syria. And it's not, of course, it's not with Iran and not with Russia, the only two or the major supporter of the government. So the government with its ally are not going to be able really to reconstruct the country by themselves. And this is why it's good to say, well, we're not going to sponsor, we're not going to finance those reconstruction projects. We're not saying that they have zero money. They will try, over the time, they will use the country resources for reconstruction. So one way is to make sure that the money is not given without any conditions. If we are to give money, then there should be certain conditions that will make sure that such practices we spoke about don't continue.
So kind of sanctions?
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily sanctions. All sanctions also affect people on the ground severely. So how to deal with this dilemma? But I think if we're speaking in a utopian world somehow, and Donatella and I have spoken a lot about this, like the government have survived on the humanitarian and the international, let's say, the international development and humanitarian support. There is a huge number of organizations working in there. They've been working even for humanitarian operations and even now. So they're part of these reconstruction projects. They're led by the government, and they're given in shares for private sector who actually benefit from the public sector benefits under the laws that were presented. But then they need the international community, and they are there in their programs, UNDP, UN Habitat, different agencies and international organizations working on rehabilitating streets, infrastructure, housing. So they're part of this. They're complicit in a way or another in the violations that are being committed. If for any reason they could be unified to say no, so this is the leverage they can play. They're doing everything without even questioning rights in the equation. So they're just rebuilding stones. They're not questioning who is going to benefit from this, who has access to these areas. Not a single question was asked about people who were evicted from here. And again, these are documented by Human Rights Watch and other organizations who've done the work on the international NGOs' engagement in rehabilitation in Homs, for example. Not a single question of where are people who used to live in here. They're just rebuilding and then giving it back to the government so that the government can redistribute again.
So again, if it's a support, then it should be conditional support with some conditions to make sure that some criteria are in place, that those practices, whoever is doing them, will not hurt people, will not lead to displacing more people, will make sure that the original people of those houses will have their houses back. So always kind of have conditions before giving money. We don't say that the international community, as we said, the international community has not given yet money for reconstruction, but they're doing some activities under the umbrella of rehabilitation or aid, which unfortunately was highly manipulated by the government. From 2011 till today, we saw like, what do you say, like the aid trunks or convoys coming and passing through towns where people really need the aid, but not unloading in those places, just carrying to the areas that were held by the government. This happened in Douma area. So such examples, such stories will tell us how much the international community was not aware of this spatial kind of dimension, spatial political dimension of the operation in such highly contested places.
Another example is the city of Aleppo that Hani explained the map of, and we've seen how the destruction is mainly in the eastern part, what came to be known as the Eastern Aleppo, and that's the opposition-held Aleppo. So after the government's offense and after the forced eviction of the people from there, the UN made a list of the top priorities neighborhood in which the reconstruction is urgently to start, with rehabilitating school and infrastructure and everything. But the governments made their own list of priorities, and they kind of matched both lists, and they only identified 8 neighborhoods in which UN is allowed to start working. And surprise, 8 neighborhoods are in Western Aleppo. None of them is in the eastern part, where most of the destruction. I think they're piloting in 3 neighborhoods now, so to be precise. But neighborhoods where they're starting now are all in Western Aleppo, so in areas that did not actually see the destruction as in the actual.
But is it that the international, I mean, sometimes, I mean, we have the Nutella showed us today the example of Raqqa and how the money is spent on public square. I mean, then how to put your priorities. I mean, this is not an area under the government control, but if you have money, do you put it on a square or you put it on a school, for example? Do you put it first in a health, to support the health system, or on
making things look better?
Make things look like, okay, we're post-conflict now, we have a beautiful square, and so on. So again, I mean, being aware of all those dynamics is really important here.
I think it's important. I would say something that resonates with what you said about destruction and reconstruction, and especially I'd like to ask you your insights about the Western understanding of destruction, or misunderstanding of destruction, and then their misunderstanding of reconstruction. So the destruction, as you illustrated, it's not a destruction of buildings. It's not a geographical destruction. It's clearly a demographic destruction. It's like evacuating these people, breaking the consolidation of the Sunni community in big groups. And then now we have like 9 million people between refugees and IDPs. And I believe the Western understanding of this problem got them into like feeling like they have leverage over the reconstruction by saying, we're not paying for reconstruction unless, which is the conditional thing you're saying. So I think the copy of reconstruction that the regime is promoting, which Europe is like now trying to just push for reconstruction to send the refugees back. I think this copy of reconstruction would eventually end up with these refugees not going back. So that's why it's very important for the Western understanding to say, if the regime, this promoting that the conflict has ended, and then investing probably in the reconstruction would actually make this decision final, that these people will never come back because their houses don't exist. How do you feel like, what kind of leverage now do the NATO, like say the Friends of Syria or the NATO countries have? And the other thing is, how does privatization, like the logic of sanctions, the regime has been escaping the logic of sanctions, in the same, using the same tool. It's like privatization, bringing more private sector to provide, knowing that there are remittances coming from outside for the Syrians. So for reconstruction, it's not really construction of houses, of the people. It's the infrastructure of the services. Because eventually, my parents, I can send them money to fix the house, and so like thousands of Syrians. But like, how does this look now? I would just end with this question. How is the Western countries like US and France and UK losing leverage using the reconstruction card? How are they losing that now in the common, like in this context? Thank you.
I think the government, the way the Maruta city as a pilot project or as the blueprint for reconstruction is being implemented clearly says that the government started by depending on the private sector, right? By giving, so they issued a law that allows for local council to establish private holding companies. These companies would benefit from the private sector benefits, but at the same time of being under the public sector, so they do not pay tax, so they have huge leverage to actually take the development zones in shares and redevelop it and then sell it back. So it's literally just like any gentrification project that we could see in here in London or in any different European city or a city in a developing country. So they're using this model for now to finance the reconstruction projects, and that's problematic because of the political context. We're not going into that again in details, but sooner or later they will need the money from abroad. So it's the billions of dollars that the reconstruction would cost. But as Hani also said, time is in the essence, so we cannot just wait until the government starts calling for, especially that they're being able to bring in investments from countries such as Japan and India and others. But I think you've also said something crucial, is that so out of tens of laws that the government issued that are very, very problematic to lead on the reconstruction project, only law number 10 got all the attention from the international community, and that's mainly because of the refugee dilemma in there, because once people understood law number 10, they realized that refugees are not going back to their homes. So that's a good point to play on, and it's just like time to say that it's not just law number 10, it's a whole complex set of legislation and procedures that are making the return impossible.
But it's important not to forget that sanction still is kind of legitimate kind of a card to play. And today we're seeing even sanction being imposed on private developers in Syria, which makes a lot of sense. As Susan said, I mean, now they're using the private sector to generate the financial capital to do those projects. So when we see such sanctions being imposed on those figures, we see it as a kind of toward the correct way.
Also, so these projects, the way they're being implemented, they do in certain contexts violate international law. And there is also work that is being done on how these are violating international law, and thus how private companies or investors or even governments or individuals who contribute to these will be also held accountable. So that's another thing to play on.
Yeah. And one of the practices or the good activities is actually to document all those violations. So we say, well, we don't stand just from, we sit in the observer seat, well, we'll be active. We're not sending money, but we're just not sitting, doing nothing. We're going to document this. This is what's happening. I mean, it's a brilliant example today we saw in Raqqa. I mean, we see people's stories being documented. We need to see the same happening for people being evicted every day, because this is going to be something to be shown tomorrow in the future.
Hi, first of all, thank you for sharing such a simplified understanding of really complex conflict, I think. My question comes from the fact that how any international observant or a participant in this context would respond depends on their understanding of the conflict. And when there is an international political and economic interests with Russia and America being part of this entire conflict, and there is no narrative which talks about that in the conflict, how do you build a counter narrative to this, or an alternative narrative to this, which would include an international political and economic understanding of the real conflict?
So an alternative narrative to how this has been a proxy war, or?
Yeah, how this has been understood as a conflict globally.
Mm-hmm. Like through reconstruction, you mean? I think it's if I understood correctly, so it's as we said, so this reconstruction is paid or is being used to pay the debt of the government to its political allies, right, in a way or another. And the proxy war is not just with weapons; it's also with investments and who controls what. So with the recently issued laws in the U.S. and the sanctions over new individuals who have actually been very active in this, like in the project that we presented in Maruta City. Some of the main individuals who own companies who are now developing are on the new lists of the sanctions. So I think the alternative narrative is playing out somehow in there. Once we how do you control, even through the development, how do you control territories, and how do you enable processes through financing and through reconstruction? So how the US is playing this with the sanctions, but how the Russia is being paid by the investments and shares. Not sure if this answers.
Yeah, but we should not dismiss that it is proxy war, and all those countries has interest in Syria, and we should not deal. I mean, as Syrian, we really like to say that this is a Syrian matter, but it's not a Syrian matter anymore. All those countries are involved, their interest is involved, and there should be some work done on that level, on the international level. Those countries who are supporting the government should be stopped. They should be told that, okay, this is enough, you're interfering in the wrong way. I mean, there should be more action. I mean, nothing will end protracted conflict more than working on the cold conflicts behind them. We need to work, as much as we work in the Syrian conflict, we need to work on the Iranian-American conflict, because it has something to do with Syria. So everything is connected, and we don't like to describe it this way because it's going to make it very complex and solvable. But this is reality. We need to try to separate as much as possible between what is local, national matter and what is international. But sometimes this is not separable, and those people should be dealt with on the international level.
Yeah, thank you. Again, thanks for an excellent presentation. My question is looking sort of east of the Euphrates, and cities like Raqqa, obviously heavily bombed, and a lot of violence there, but in opposition areas, and obviously the politics hasn't fully played out. But how do you see areas like that going forward in sort of reconstruction perspective? Thank you.
Do you want to take this one? I think
specifically on Raqqa.
Yeah.
I mean, Raqqa is a bit different than it's a bit different than other areas, because at the moment Raqqa is in the hands of the sort of self-governing Kurdish administration, but we all know that it will be handed back to the regime in Damascus, and so it's a time of great uncertainty for people in Raqqa. Certainly, those who caused the destruction in Raqqa are the wealthiest countries in the world, but who are not even pretending that they intend to offer aid to people who lost their homes and everything. So I think that once Raqqa goes back to being under the control of the Syrian government, the same factors that are at play elsewhere will be at play in Raqqa. We just don't know when that will be. It's likely to be quite soon. But for now, there is no plan for the development in a place like Raqqa. There is a little bit of aid for public infrastructure, but not for people to rebuild their homes or anything like that. I think everybody's kind of waiting, and I think the fate will be very much that of the rest of the country.
I think there has been recently an announcement, right, that a new city will be built out of the Yeferets.
Yeah, that is the suggestion of another city to be built in the southern of
Yeah.
Yeferet.
So even in the current scenario, which is again problematic in itself, why building a new city for the displaced and for the why not? I mean, people are returning to their homes. In the exhibition, we've seen laundry. We've seen there's life still in the rubble. So people are going back to their lives, are trying to reconstruct whatever they can, rehabilitate whatever they can. So why go and build a new city where already people can do a lot? So they just need the support and.
I think there's one question there, and then.
Thank you. I just wanted to take you back to a point you touched upon on sectarianism, because what you've been talking about is reconstructing homes that belong to people. But inevitably the conflict was sectarian. The international dimensions of the conflict are sectarian. Iran is not trying to help all Syrians. They're trying to help specifically regime-aligned Syrians. And sorry, a point about the sanctions as well, that's where they can help as well, because it's not just about targeting the Syrian regime with sanctions, it's also about targeting Iran, which we have been doing as the West. It's also about targeting international proxies of Iran in Lebanon, for example, through Hezbollah and their international dimensions. Sorry, side note on that. But back to that, is it just a matter of reconstructing Syria back to where it was just immediately before the outbreak of the revolution, or is it about building a new kind of Syria with new dynamics in terms of sectarian relationships?
Well,
You mean what the government is trying to do, right? With the current reconstruction?
No, not the government.
so the question is that, I mean, we cannot build anything back to its original status, right? Nothing, I mean, reconstruction, I mean, the term itself is not, I mean, for me, it's not logical. You cannot reconstruct. I mean, you need to construct actually a new country that will preserve the right of people. So when we say it has a sectarian dimension, yes, it has. I mean, people who lived in there, despite of their background, should be served, right? Should return to their original houses. But we don't aim to construct Syria back to its original place, because that original status was the reason for the conflict in the first place. The people, urban and other grievances was the driver of the conflict. This is why people revolt against the government. People were not having adequate housing, they were not having adequate services. There was some political pressure, sometimes sectarian pressure to some extent, although I don't like to call it like a sectarian war, especially in the first period of it. But this status, the pre-war status, was the reason for the conflict. So we want to construct Syria, but the hope is for the better, in a way that won't contribute to creating new layers of conflict. This should be always the main aim. I mean, whenever we contribute to creating conflict, then it's wrong. Simple. Whenever we're contributing to make peace and preserving the rights of people, then we're going in the correct direction. If you want to.
Thank you for your presentation. I mean, it's quite apparent that we might, with this kind of a demographic conflict emerging from the ongoing conflict now, from the womb of the ongoing conflict. And one of the main approaches you suggested was the quick, rapid interfering of the EU and the US in an immediate kind of reconstruction funding, if I can say. But my question is that how do we know that the EU or the US are able to change any legislations that have already been enacted if they want to work under the umbrella of the government, or they want to cooperate with the government? Because we're assuming that if they interfere immediately, they will be able to change something for the interest of the people, while we have two constraints here. First, the legislations and the cooperation, the complicated cooperation that will happen between the regime and the EU. And second, that the EU will come as investors. They also want to invest in the country. And the best interest of the people will not be, I think, a major criteria. It could be, but it might not be a major criteria. So, yeah, thank you.
I think it's the conditionality of the funding that we're stressing here, because the position that's clear now of the EU and the US is that the money of reconstruction is being held until there is a genuine, legitimate political transition in the country. And that's very vague and very out of the reach at the moment. And what we're trying to say is that waiting until this happens is only making the type of reconstruction that we've seen more consolidated, and is only making the environment more hostile for any new, more rights-based, legitimate, inclusive approach to reconstruction. So I think what we're calling for is an intervention, is to release the money, but to stress the conditionality of this to be based on rights, and then you have the leverage to play with what governs the projects that are being implemented. I think that the attention that law number 10 got worldwide, and that statements were made by the Lebanese government, who hosts big number of refugees, and by the German government, and that put pressure on the government somehow to amend some of the clauses in the decree. So the very tight procedural requirements were loosened a little bit still. And that's nothing really to solve the problem. But I think I at least believe in pressure, in putting pressure, or at least I believe that there is leverage to be played with the money. But when we embrace the conditionality of that, the power of its conditionality.
But I mean, from a technical perspective and from an operational perspective, there are some solutions. People are now trying to find ways around it. It's not simple, it's very complex, but people are studying, researching, and trying to find ways around. Some of the suggestions saying that we'll do something outside of the regime control area, at least to show example that will, if you don't make the changes we're asking you for on the legislative framework, then we're going to partner with some other people. This is one way. Another way is to go local. Instead of thinking of national reconstruction framework, why don't we say, well, we go to the local level, we say, well, we're going to support this and that project in those localities, say town scale, or even in neighborhood scale, small scale, a scale that the central government or the government has no control over. Say, well, we want to work directly with the local council in a way that we overpass some of the framework that the regime put in place. So that's just an example. I'm not saying that this is a solution, but people, if they think hard enough, if they go into the detail of the context, because not every, I mean, we show like a map of Syria with 4 colors. But if we think of it really from other dimension, from the political dimension, demographic dimension, from the other dimension, then we'll see it maybe 100 colors or 200 colors, more than this. So it's not the same. It's not one homogeneous kind of context. So for those people who are working on Syria, like we do, we try to find our way through this complexity to say, well, this is a place, specific place, very small place, where we can show a good example of reconstruction practice. Why? Because it's not time yet to do national reconstruction, but we cannot wait at the same time. Is this going really to help? We don't know, but at least we're doing our duty. So for us, this is why we chosen, for example, one specific place in northern Syria to say, well, this is the town we're going to work on. is not only because it's outside of the regime control area, but it's well because under the control of a specific local council with a specific mindset that will help us start our pilot project, for example. See, so what we're saying, conditionality on one hand, on the other hand, understanding the context in its depth and trying to find a way around. Not to say, well, this is Syria, this is how we're treating it. No money for now, end of statement, very short statement, and that's it. It doesn't work this way. And I think the same goes for every conflict context nowadays, because every conflict context is very complex and it's very diverse in its dynamics.
Thank you, Hani and Sosan, for your presentation. You touched a bit about what I was going to ask, but I was going to ask one of the alternatives to the monotone rebuilding, reconstruction, or method of reconstruction of the government is what you are doing in your own personal initiative, which is like maybe participating with the people in bringing houses to them. Or in other words, community architecture. Do you think there is a way of developing that? Maybe how to develop that, how to spot that on the map, or to ask other parts of EU to really fund that or support that? Thank you.
So thank you for bringing up this question. We're really passionate about our project, but we don't want to promise a lot. I mean, as I said, to do successful project, then you need to find the good environment for it. Well, in Syria, unfortunately, those environments don't exist in every place, right? What we're trying to do through our project, which is very small, and we're going to grow up a little bit by bit, what we're saying, we're going actually to create this environment. So we say we cannot do reconstruction project or housing project at a scale unless we have a collaborative local council, like good authority, people who understand what planning is, understand what housing is, and share with us the same vision. But we don't have such council, neither in the regime-held area nor in the opposition area. So what we say, well, we do the first step, we'll tell them what our project is. In the second step, we'll say, why don't you invite someone from your local council to be part of the project? And the step after, we say, okay, this is a framework that can be how we can scale our initiative. This is what you need to do. This is what we need to do. So it's like a step by step, creating the environment, a welcoming environment for good practice of housing. And the same can be taken for reconstruction project. No reconstruction will happen immediately. I mean, reconstruction will take years and years and years. Maybe we won't see it. Maybe our kids are going to see it. So we don't want this sort of reconstruction where something like what happened in Lebanon, just build the old town in a way that will become like a ghost city, no one will come to it. The old souk became like modern, very expensive souk. We don't want this reconstruction. So the reconstruction we're looking at is a reconstruction, which is a long process. It's going to take a lot of time. It involves a lot of building capacity practices. It involves a lot of kind of creating shared visions with people, with government, with local community. So this is the process we're talking about. People who sit and design those interventions, they need to be aware of those dynamics. On our side, we're trying to be as much as possible aware of those dynamics, and we're trying to propose a small project to showcase how project can create actually an environment to allow scaling up of good practices for reconstruction.
I think I can add 2 points on that. First is I think the need is massive, and we're aware that, again, nothing could be solved at once. It's going to be an incremental process, but a process where a lot of informal activities will be happening, and that's crucial to acknowledge and to accept and to embrace and to build upon. Informality in the Syrian context is a contested term, and it's usually looked negatively at, even by the mindset of people in general. And we need to acknowledge that there wouldn't be projects to solve everything in the country. People would start doing everything they can whenever they can, and that would result in more informal practices being there. And that's a huge positive opportunity that we need to work with and to build upon. And for that, it's important to work on the interpretation and the understanding and how we reframe understanding of certain things. So it's a lot to do with the people, but also if at a certain point with authorities who are responsible for planning and for implementation. And the other thing is to be very aware of not shifting responsibilities. I mean, what you called community architecture and what's crucial to ensure an inclusive and a participatory results. And because the need is massive and it needs everyone to put their hands there and start working on stuff, we need people to initiate good models and good alternatives, but it's crucial to work with local authorities on that. If local authorities are not in with these projects, then they're just going to be, they wouldn't really change the structures if we can't. So one thing is to scale them up horizontally to make sure that they're more spread, that they're covering different location, different scenarios, etc. But the other is to scale them up institutionally, how to make sure that the structures are more welcoming for these alternatives and for other practices other than the traditional way of dealing with planning and architecture and the built environment in general, in the Syrian context, but also elsewhere.
Yeah, hi, I have a last question. You talk about the EU not wanting to give the money under a certain set of conditions, but at the same time, a lot of Europeans and American companies are settling in neighboring countries and hope to reconstruct Syria from those neighboring countries. I mean, I know that Lebanon, for example, has just released the McKinsey report, which says that it's going to save its economy through the reconstruction of Syria. And all of that is backed up by EU and US money. So don't you think that there's a sort of hypocrisy situation going on there? And also, how much do you think that Syria is depending on its neighboring country to reconstruct itself, knowing that its industry has been very heavily damaged, so they don't have the capacity to respond to the urgency of the demand right now?
I think, yeah, it's a hypocrisy. That's what we're trying to say. And on big statements, they're saying we're holding the fund until there is a genuine, legitimate political transition in place. But then we see money going through different routes under rehabilitation projects and humanitarian aid and a little project here for infrastructure and public squares and the UN and other international NGOs are working well. But it's in the international development system and international humanitarian system. That's how do you identify humanitarian fund and how do you identify develop? When do you move a case from being in the humanitarian zone to the long-term development zone? That's very, it's funny how they deal with these things within the bureaucracies of NGOs. Like, where do you move cases between which team works on what? Why would Syria not be dealt with as a long-term development project if we're seeing that still in the humanitarian fund money is going for preparing infrastructure and also dealing with homes? Well, homes are then being turned into projects that are just completely turning a blind eye on rights and everything. So they're very much interlinked, and it's very much a hypocrisy. That's what we're trying to say. So the solution is not by holding reconstruction fund while releasing other fund that is liquid and that can go to fund other things. It's how to have a unified, a solid plan on how to control, to put the conditionality of these things so that they're more rights-based rather than for the other part, what was it? The countries.
Don't you think in a way it's happening in this sense because the European countries have simply not been invited to reconstruct Syria? The Syrian regime has promised its allies that fought with them that they will get the reconstruction, putting countries like France and the US and Britain, they excluded them. So in a way, it's also the European accepting the fate that they will not directly at least be part of that reconstruction.
Reconstruction has been used as an award. It's very simple and straightforward. I mean, all the contracts has been given to government supporting countries. I mean, the phosphate contracts, the big port on the sea. I mean, in a way, they're even controlling. This is something again. I mean, time. I mean, the more we wait, the more those mechanisms will be in place. So if we want really to go to more in the future, maybe wait more, and then we say, well, now we're doing reconstruction, we will find an environment which is totally controlled by the regime allies and the regime itself. So let's say, well, you want to import something, then the only port we have is the Russian port. You want to buy like material to reconstruct, okay, do your project, but if you want to import to use locally produced material, then it's being brought from the mines that are controlled by Russia. And some of the contracts are already signed now and in a place. So this is why, I mean, waiting will not help at all. Waiting will just make sure that even when good reconstruction try to happen, we won't find the environment for it.
Okay, I think there is one last question from here.
Hello. So for those that have been relocated and displaced, do you feel that there's support and ample sort of structure community-wise for those people? I've a friend that came from Syria that was just the terrible stories that he told me, and witnessing that and sort of being there in the UK as a friend was something that sort of spoke, you know, more miles than a lot of other people are almost willing to do. So I'm just, from your perspective, do you feel that in worldwide, or specifically in Europe, there is that kind of that support system for those people that have been through a situation that is absolutely catastrophic?
So, yeah, I mean, myself, from personal experience, I think, I mean, the friends I made here in the UK was like really important aspect of my life, let's say. It's important for everyone to find this support system. I'm not really aware of the details of what sort of programs are here for, or generally in the world, for refugees to support them. I wasn't part of any of those programs, but I think it's very important for people on transitional phase to find that at least we have a society to belong to. The question is, belonging is really kind of critical, and it's very important for every Syrian. Those who are leaving their communities, the places they used to live in, their memories, they need, I mean, I think every Syrian is or passed through sort of trauma, at least maybe this side or that side. I don't believe that anyone doesn't have a sort of a trauma because of what we've been through. Even if you did not experience yourself like destruction or someone close to you died, but you still, from what you saw on the TV, from the news, from everyone like caring about this Syria, everyone talking about it from this different perspective, misunderstanding it, sometimes understanding it, sometimes totally getting wrong. I mean, this is like a really, by itself, is a trauma cause. So people need the support, and but if Syrian going to go back home, I mean, this is a question no one can answer. I think personally that many of the Syrian will not return, sometimes because of security, political reason, some other because it's just been away for long and now they have a new life to live, so they don't want to come back. But it's not the story for everyone. I think everyone, at least for now, it's been only 8 years. I think the majority, or at least every friend I have, is kind of really keen to see that someday I can go back to Syria.
I think it's about embracing this uncertainty. I mean, not to ask the simplistic question of do you want to return or not.
Yeah.
No one knows. No one really knows. No one wants to be away, but no one really knows if they can, or if they are willing to, or if they want, or because we're building a whole set of new lives in here, and it still doesn't feel like home here, but it's never felt like home in Syria. So it's in that journey of looking for the place that you can feel institutionally secure, and not just from the war, but also where you feel you have an institutions that will protect you. And that's something that we find here in a way or another. But it's also a place that you feel familiar with its culture, with its everyday practices, with its people, with the people on the streets, on their balconies. So it's how neither places gave what we gave a full sense of home. And it's just a very hard question to ask. And it's just
difficult to answer as
embrace
well.
this uncertainty
Yeah.
is what we can do in an efficient support system, a
Yes.
system that can give you access but also an easy exit out of it.
Okay, I think that's a very nice way to end. Please join us thanking Soshan and Hani for this very, very, very interesting
Thank
and
you.
amazing intervention. Thank you so much.
Thank you.